Let's add real authentication. Let's go out to Firebase. We have our real-time database. And there's this enticing menu choice, authentication. Authenticate and manage users from a variety of providers without server-side code. Cool. There's a learn more. There's a view the docs. I'm going to go ahead and open up the docs in a new tab because that seems like it could be useful. There's a tab here for sign-in method. Let's see what that has in it. Sign-in providers, email password, phone, Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, anonymous. So these are all the different sign-in providers we can use. Firebase is a Google product. So if you're in the Firebase console, you definitely have a Google account. So how about we try Google authentication? Let's click this, see what happens. All right, there's an enable on off. Sure, enable. Google sign-in is automatically configured on your connected iOS and web apps. To set up Google sign-in for your Android apps, blah, blah, blah. Okay, automatic. All right, if you say so. Let's save. Okay, it's enabled. Let's look at the docs. See what we really have to do. Authentication. Tells us what authentication is. That's neat. It provides easy-to-use SDKs and ready-made UI libraries. Authentication using passwords, phone numbers. Google, Facebook, Twitter. Firebase authentication integrates tightly with other Firebase services, and it leverages industry standards like OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect, so it can easily be integrated with your custom backend. So it's OAuth we're going to be using, which is an industry standard for authentication with third-party services. Key capabilities. You can sign in users to your Firebase using either Firebase UI, or the authentication SDK. That's probably what we're going to do. So let's see. We're on the web. So let's see. Web, get started. Connect your app to Firebase. I think we've pretty much done that. Sign up new users. Yeah, if we're doing email and password, but we're not. We're doing Google. Set an authentication state observer and get user data. For each of your app's pages that need information about the signed-in user, attach an observer to the global authentication object. Okay, whatever that means. On auth state changed. So it's saying there's a way to tell whether the state of our authentication just changed. Either we went from signed out to signed in, or we went from signed in to signed out. That seems like something we'll need to know at one time or another. Learn how to add support for other identity providers and anonymous. Yep, Google sign in. Let's learn about that. Handle the sign-in flow with Firebase SDK. Follow these steps. Create an instance of the Google provider object. New firebase.auth.googleauth provider. Okay, so where the heck are we going to do that? Here's authentication provider documentation, since we don't really know what these things are. Oh, man. That's a little dense. First of all, there's firebase.auth. Do we have such a thing? Let's see. This is what they want us to do. New firebase.auth.googleauth provider. So let's look at base.js. That's where we have Firebase imported, right? Can I say const Google provider equals that thing I copied and pasted? New, so this thing must be a constructor. Firebase.auth.googleauth provider. Explode. Cannot read property Google auth provider if undefined. So what's undefined? Cannot read property Google auth provider if undefined. What does that mean is undefined? Whatever's to the left of the dot in front of Google auth provider, right? Because it says we're trying to get to the property Google auth provider of undefined. So firebase.auth must be undefined. Get it? And here's the deal. Just importing Firebase doesn't get you the auth portion. We had to import database separately, right? We also have to import Firebase /auth. And we don't need to import it as anything because it actually just adds stuff to the Firebase object that we already have. We don't need to import auth from there or something. Importing that is just going to make firebase.auth a thing. And I accidentally typed some junk there. Okay, error went away. Cool. So we want to use this in our sign-in component. So to authenticate with that thing, you can prompt your user to sign in with their Google account either by opening a pop-up window or by redirecting to the sign-in page. Redirect method is preferred on mobile devices. To sign in with a pop-up window, call sign in with pop-up on firebase.auth parentheses, the return value of whatever firebase.auth is. So I want to do this from inside sign-in. So what I'm going to do is actually export this Google provider, export const Google provider, and I'm going to go ahead and call that firebase.auth method. I'm going to export const auth, I'll call it, and that's going to be my app.auth. So now I have this auth object that I can use. And I have this Google provider, which is an instance of firebase.auth.googleauthprovider. And if I want to use these things in sign-in, what can I do? I can import them, right? So if I just import something from base.js, like base, what am I importing? The default, right? If I want to import something other than the default, what do I do? How do you import something other than the default? Like import a named export. These are named exports. By saying export const auth instead of export default. This is now an export called auth. Can I just say import auth? If I did that, it's just going to name the default auth. But it'll still be this object. What do I do? What do I do differently? Somebody. Anybody. We've done it before. Yeah, Todd.
Can you just do comma and then inside curly braces like the name of the thing?
If we wanted to do both the default and a named import, yeah. You'd put the default outside curly braces and the other inside curly braces. We don't actually need the default in this one. We only need the named stuff. So, curly braces. right? What we do when we import component, for example. We import React from React. That's the default export. But we also import the named export component. And here we're importing the named export auth. And how about Google Provider 2? Auth, comma, Google Provider inside curly braces. So we want to try to use these. So we see this sign in with pop-up thing, which takes a provider as its argument. And we have this Google provider, right? So instead of just calling handle auth inside authenticate, let's call this auth thing that we imported dot sign in. Oh, we have all these options. Sign in with pop-up. And it takes a provider, an auth provider as its argument, and we have Google provider all ready to go. And it looks like in the example here, they say dot then something. Ever seen dot then before? Anybody know what the heck that means? Yeah.
I think it's like once whatever's completed in front of it, once that's done, then the deferrers decide to go to that.
Then do the next thing, and it looks like it takes a function. So we could say auth.signin with popup.then something. And that something could be a function, like handle auth maybe. Or it wants the actual function, so we don't put the parentheses in there, right? So that's because sign in with popup returns something called a promise. And we're not going to get real deep into promises, but it's a relatively recent mechanism for doing asynchronous things. And by asynchronous, we mean something happens in the background. So when you run sign in with popup, it's going to have to do something. It's going to pop up a pop-up. You're going to have to sign in with Google, blah, blah, blah. But it's going to go ahead and run whatever the next line of code is without waiting for that to finish. So if we run handle auth immediately, we're not going to have the data we need from sign in with popup yet. So the old way was just to pass in a callback or something to the original function. But with promises, you call .then and pass a callback to that, and that runs when this thing finishes. There are lots of different mechanisms for doing this in JavaScript. Promises are a standard way, permanently part of the language as of ES6. They were available through some third-party libraries before that. Makes it nice and readable. Auth, sign in with popup, then handle auth. And it looks like that callback is going to get some sort of object. Cool. What does this actually do? And if we call handle auth, it's now expecting some sort of argument. Don't know what that is. Let's just see what it is. All right. Click sign in. I have a pop-up. It tells me to choose an account, a Google account. It tells me that that's going to then redirect me to Firebase. I will log in as my Get Fretless person. Oh, and there I am. And here's what I console logged. some object with a few different properties, one of which is user. Drill into user. See some things I don't understand. I also see display name and email. That's cool. Email verified, true. Is anonymous, false. Phone number. Photo URL. Gosh, it's even my avatar. Refresh token. UID. This looks like a unique identifier for this user. You could save something else if you wanted. You could save this entire user object if you want. Might be useful to have the display name and stuff like that too. But for right this second, I'm concerned with just a way to uniquely identify this person. So UID is good enough for me. So that was, again, that result.user.uid. So here's that result object, then user, then UID was a property of that. So what I want to do and handle auth is set state UID, not just hard coding dstruce, but setting it to result.user.uid. Seem reasonable? See any more clues here? What about signing out? Ah, here we go. To sign out a user, call sign out. Firebase.auth parens .signout, which appears to also return a promise. So sign out needs to call sign out on this auth object. So we need to import that in app as well. So in app, we are already importing base from base. We want to add that auth export. So comma, curly braces, auth. Yeah.
When do you export as default and when you export as not default?
I'm sorry, say that again.
When do you export as default and then also not as default? Like, how do you choose? How do you decide that?
So, like in this case, I just figured our rebase thing is kind of the main thing that we're configuring here. But there is more stuff that I want available, but I don't need it everywhere. So just make those named. In this case, we added them after the fact, so it was kind of an easy choice. If there's only one thing you need to export, I would make it default. If you need more than one, just see which one makes the most sense, kind of based on maybe the name of your file.
There's like one default and then unlimited.
Correct. Correct. Yep, only one default. So we're importing auth, and in our sign out method, which we already have, and right now it just sets UID to null, we learned we need to call auth.signout. And that apparently returns a promise as well, because we have this .then. So we'll say auth sign out, then when that's finished, we'll set state. But then expects a function, not the result of a function. So we can just put a little arrow function in here that calls this .set state. Setting the UID back to null. Make sense? So when this starts, we're signed out. The sign in button in our sidebar, I mean, not in our sidebar, in our sign in component, right, is going to call authenticate. Authenticate takes this auth object that we exported from base and calls sign in with pop-up on that. Sign in with pop-up needs to know what auth provider you're using. Twitter, Facebook, GitHub, Google. We're using Google, which we also did over in base.js and exported it. Then when it's finished signing in with pop-up, it calls handle auth. Handle auth was passed down as a prop. Here it is. It receives a result because we saw that whatever gets called after sign in with pop-up finishes is going to receive some sort of argument. We looked at what that is in a console log, and we saw that it was something with a user property. And that user property had a UID, and that's what we want to store on our state. So handle auth simply sets that on state. And that happens to be just exactly what this signed in method is looking for. The presence of that UID on state. If it's there, we're signed in. And down in render, we're deciding that if that's true, we render main. Otherwise, we render sign in. So let's watch that much happen. Let's look at our React DevTools, look at app. We see state, UID, null. Click sign in. Opens our pop-up. Pick my account. Sends me back. And now state UID is something. And I see my stuff. So the sign out button, which is in the sidebar, calls sign out, which was also passed down as a prop. Here it is. That uses this auth object that we imported and calls sign out on it. And when that finishes, it calls this function, which calls set state again, setting UID back to null. Let's watch that happen. State is UID is currently this. Click sign out. It's back to null. Main went away. And now we just have sign in. You dig? Sign in. Sign out. Voila. Yep, let me commit real quick. Add Google authentication.